Welcome, everyone. I'm Andrew Schiff, CEO here at the Rhode Island Community Food Bank. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation with Mark Bittman about his new book, Animal Vegetable Junk: A History of Food from Sustainable to Suicidal. I want you all to know that we're going to absolutely take questions from audience members today. If at any time you have a question for Mark, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Click on that, type in your question, and we'll do our best to answer all of your questions. I'm sure that everybody in our audience today is very familiar with Mark Bittman. Some of us have followed him through his many years as New York Times columnist. We've watched him on TV. We've purchased his cookbooks. My personal favorite is How to Cook Everything Vegetarian. We remember his visit to Rhode Island for a wonderful food bank event that it's hard to believe, but it was 10 years ago. Feels like yesterday. Anyway, I'm really excited to be able to speak with Mark today about his new book that is a critical account of our history with food and how we end up with the food system that we have today. So please join me, Mark. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Great to see you. I cannot believe it's been 10 years.
10 years, I know. So I'm gonna do my best to channel Terry Gross. To write this book, even after all your years of food writing, you had to dig deep into the history of humanity's relationship with food. And I'm wondering, what did you learn?
Well, I learned probably 90% of the stuff that's in there and then some. I don't lack confidence when it comes to projects. In fact, I'm probably way too arrogant or confident. But this was really, I won't say it nearly killed me. That would be an exaggeration. But I worked really hard, and like as with so many books and other creative works too, there's a lot on the cutting room floor that didn't make it in. The history, which is pretty much the longest part of the book, was the most interesting and the newest to me. So I knew this and that, but I hadn't put together in my mind. I couldn't have explained 2 years ago, 3 years ago, how colonialism led to white supremacy and the Homestead Act and how that's relationship to industrial agriculture and even junk food. I couldn't have sort of explained that string, and now I can, and it's clear to me. And I think that's an important part of the work, is being able to say it wasn't inevitable, it didn't have to be this way, but this is the way it happened, and it follows. One thing follows from another, and that I'm an old '60s radical. I've always believed or long believed that many of society's problems are interrelated, and you can't really address any of them individually without tackling the big picture. This reinforced that, but it gave me a wealth of an arsenal of detail that I didn't have before. So there's that. And then there's the contemporary stuff, which I kind of honed my knowledge about. And then the looking forward to the future is very, very much a work in progress. I did that work for the book, but things the present is always being redefined, and consequently the future is always being redefined. So, but the past is, kind of fixed. So that part, there's really a wealth of material there to access and learn about, and that was the bulk of the work, I think.
Looking at the food system where we've ended up, seems like we produce food kind of the way we produce cars and computers and computer chips. But food should be different, right?
Well, that's my feeling. I mean, that's not only my feeling, it's what I want people to come away from this talk and away from reading the book feeling the same way. We produce animals and crops as if they were disposable. We use the same kind of extractive mentality that we use for mining. We don't think about replenishing the soil. We don't think about sustainability. Has become a meaningless word, but it means the capacity to endure, and we don't really think about that when it comes to farming. But probably most importantly is that we produce food primarily to make money. And we don't produce food primarily to nourish people. And yet when you look in the dictionary for the definition of food, it says it's a source of nourishment. It's a source of nutrition. It's supposed to make people healthy. And that's not what food does for us. Food makes us ill. It's not a stretch to say that it's poisoning the land and the water and the air. It's using resources at an unreplenishable rate. It's damaging us morally because the way we treat animals especially, but the earth in general, but animals especially, it's damaging for our own souls to think of other lives as completely and 100% disposable. All of these are problems with the way that the food system is organized, and they stem directly from the fact that it's organized primarily, almost exclusively, to make money.
Well, that makes me wonder how it could have been different. What would a supermarket look like today if we had made decisions about the food system that prioritized health rather than profit? What would a supermarket look like?
Well, maybe instead of being 80% junk food and 20% real food, it would be 80% real food and 20% junk food. That would be the supermarket of your dreams. And many of us who sort of remember the 70s, when every neighborhood had a kind of funky health food market, and it was before most health food became junk food. It was before Whole Foods. It was when there were stores where the owners would say, we're only going to sell things that are good for you. And those were very small stores with a limited selection of stuff, sometimes very weird stuff. But nevertheless, you didn't have aisle after aisle of sodas and chips and junk food of all kinds. Now, of course, health food stores are just glorified supermarkets or have been incorporated into stores like Whole Foods, and they're not that different from supermarkets. But we can imagine a supermarket where the dominant products were fresh vegetables, whole grains, legumes, dairy, meat, and there wasn't aisle after aisle of, the fact that there is an aisle completely devoted to soda, and it's a big aisle. We all know what a Stop and Shop looks like, and if you just imagine in your mind that there's an entire aisle 10 times the size of a corner store that's just soda, that's just chips and dips, that's just weird frozen foods, that's just so-called snacks and so on. We don't need that much choice in the junk food arena. A little bit would go a long way.
That stuff is easier to store. It's easy to keep.
Well, that's a good point. Soda, I would think that soda has an indefinite shelf life. It's not only that it's easy to keep, it's most of the stuff has as its source corn and soybeans, which are our two biggest crops for industrial agriculture, crops that are easy to grow, relatively easy to grow, around which an entire industry has formed to make them easier to grow. So very specific seeds, machinery, chemicals, soil preparation techniques. USDA and agricultural extension and research stations have spent 100 years trying to figure out how to perfect the maximum yield of corn and soybeans from soil and the elimination of all other life forms on those plots of land. And the result is that we have so much of that stuff that we have invented all of these new foods, quote unquote foods, that are really, they're derivative of real foods. There's nothing wrong with corn and soybeans per se. They're perfectly fine foods, but the second and third generation iterations of them, the things that are derived from them, are these highly processed foods, ultra processed foods, junk foods, whatever you want to call them, that last forever, that are really cheap to produce, that provide us with calories that are not good for us, that are high profit, that, as you say, have long shelf life, and so on.
At the food bank, we're particularly concerned about food insecurity in Rhode Island, about helping people who can't afford adequate food. And it seems like the food system in particular fails people who have incomes below poverty. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
I mean, there are so many threads to unravel on that one question, because around the world, land has been taken from people who might call themselves peasants or small stakeholders or whatever you like. Land has been taken from those people and integrated into big farms that none of them can do anything but maybe work on. And this began variously in the 12th century, in the 15th and 16th centuries, accelerated in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it goes on today. So, at the end of the Civil War, there was the potential of giving land to 1 million Black farmers, descendants of formerly enslaved people. And that didn't happen. If that had happened, there would have been 1 million more people on the land working small farms. So that's a significant number, and that also would have changed income levels for African American people. It would have changed the entire look of the United States in the 20th century. Okay, that didn't happen, and it's a tragedy that didn't happen. What also didn't happen was government support for small farmers. And most people think of the 80s as a time when the small farms started to disappear, Farm Aid and Willie Nelson and all that stuff. But really, it was the 1880s when the small farm began to disappear. In fact, it began to disappear almost as soon as it was established. So the federal government, and in various forms, took land away from indigenous Americans, gave it to almost exclusively white male European immigrants, but it didn't support those people except to say, we will try to keep you out of the wars that we're fighting with indigenous Americans and try to keep your land relatively stable. But there wasn't the kind of aid that farmers needed to learn how to farm this new land this newly conquered land in what became what was the United States. So consequently, small farms were disappearing almost as soon as they were established. And the Dust Bowl is obviously the most dramatic event of the last 100 years in that arena. But small farms were being gobbled up by bigger farms, and fewer people could make their living as farmers. In general, it became harder and harder for people without money to gain money. Income inequality became more and more fixed. The oligarchy became more and more entrenched. Um, and at the same time as all of this is happening, the thing we talked about 5 minutes ago was happening, which is that industrially processed food, primarily corn and soybeans and wheat, were turned into junk food. And that junk food now makes up more than half of the calories available in the United States. So the best estimate I can come up with is that 60% of calories in the market today are in the form of ultra processed food. Now, as we talked about a little while ago, that food's not good for you. It's not even really food. So if 60% of the calories out in the market are bad for you, someone's eating those calories. Well, guess who's eating those calories? The people who can't afford to eat better calories. And it's not a question of decisions or choice. Someone is eating that 60% of calories. Either 100% of us are getting 60% of our calories from junk food. It's not quite that. Or 60% of us are getting 100% of our calories from junk food. It's not that either. Somewhere in there is the great mishmash of Americans. We all eat some junk food, but those of us with more money eat less of it and eat more high quality food. And those of us with less money resort to the bodega, resort to the fast food drive-through window, resort to the junk food aisle where things are fast and cheap, and live increasingly unhealthy lives, eating increasingly bad food.
With all sorts of, well-known health effects, but we're inundated with marketing of junk food. All of us are. And it just seems so hard to do anything about that level of marketing. So I wonder what can we do, not as individuals, but as a society, to decrease the consumption of all of this junk?
Well, part of it is availability. And part of it, of course, is marketing, as you say, that they're tied together. But if 60% of the calories are junk food, then someone's going to eat them. So it's up to the marketers to figure out, it's up to the processors to use all that surplus to produce junk food, and it's up to the marketers to figure out how to get us to eat that. Part of it is simply attacking children with marketing before they even know the difference between right and wrong. Some of it is availability. Some of it is convenience. I mean, if you look at what a McDonald's or, just for example, McDonald's looks like, you could argue that this is really the structure of a way of getting food into as many hands, many mouths as possible very easily. You can go to the drive-thru, you can walk up to the counter, you can order online, you can order at the kiosk, you can eat in, you can take it out, you can do anything you want. It's pretty fast, it's pretty inexpensive. The only problem, is the food is bad, the atmosphere is kind of blah, the labor is treated badly, but I'm saying that the concept is not terrible. So when it comes to, I better clarify that. The concept as a food delivery system is not terrible. The concept otherwise is pretty terrible. But I think if we look at any of these issues, but let's take marketing of junk for one, but if we look at any of these issues, there's kind of three ways to support progress. So the first way is to defend any rights that people already have to better food. And in the marketing of junk to children, that's almost nil. That's a real problem. In the 70s, the Federal Trade Commission had a panel that said, we think that marketing to junk to children should be limited. And there was progress being made on that. And then Ronald Reagan became president and basically kneecapped the Federal Trade Commission. So, but let's say we're talking about food for decent food for people of low income. There are some programs that we can protect, and it's important that we all protect the existing programs that help people of lower income to eat halfway decently. So it's always that sort of, let's look first at what the emergencies are, what the provisions for a slightly better food system than it would be otherwise are. Let's make sure those don't go away. That's number one. Number two is, how do we model a better way to do things? How do we look at, as you just said, what does the supermarket of the future look like? Can we build one and show people what it might look like? Can we build, you've built a better food pantry. You've made decisions in the last, since you and I have known each other, you've made decisions that say, we're going to do this better. Here's a model for food pantries. Here's a model that people in the emergency food system can learn from. So that's the sort of second thing. How do we model things? How do we make a really good farm? How do we make a terrific nonprofit? And so on. How do we do community organizing around urban agriculture? All of that kind of stuff. Those are models. And then the third thing is, what policies, what programs are going to move us forward? What do we need to see next? How do we have the research done and the policy organized and the political power in place to reduce the use of pesticides in agriculture? People are working on this. I'm not saying they're not. How do we work on it together and get to a point where we can reduce pesticide use, we can get antibiotics out of the food supply, we can stop rapacious marketing of food, to junk food to children, we can reduce the number of CAFOs, we can reduce carcinogens in the atmosphere, especially in areas of environmental racism, on and on. I could go on. But those three pillars, how do we protect the rights that we already have? How do we model for a better world? And what policies do we need to start moving us to a better food system? I think you can answer any question about food, or almost anything else for that matter, with those three questions. I mean, if you took income, gender discrimination, anything, and you applied those three forms, protect the rights we have, model for something better, look to improve policies and programs, that's a good starting place for almost anything. And I'm sorry to be going on, but this is all stuff I learned since I wrote the book, because I had to learn what I wrote in Animal Vegetable Junk in order to be able to talk about it articulately. And I hope I'm talking articulately, speaking articulately. And once I could do that, I became engaged in so many of these conversations that I was really able to, because I didn't want to just say, oh, here's the history of food, here's why it sucks right now, maybe we can do something better about it. I wanted to be able to say, these are the things to focus on. This is why food is an important issue. Food is to nourish people. It's important to think about that. It's not just here to make money for corporations and so on. And I think that now, modesty aside or whatever, I've done this enough so that I feel like the message is kind of honed, and I could say the things that I really mean and say them well, but not all of them were in that book. But I finished the book a year ago. Things change.
Well, a year ago, after the outbreak of COVID-19, we saw like the whole food supply chain jam up. I'm sure that didn't surprise you. But looking at what's happened during COVID-19, are lessons that we can learn from our experience with this crisis?
I mean, you're as good a person, probably better equipped to answer that question than I am, or at least, you have specific experience. We all saw pigs being slaughtered and milk being dumped and so on. And we all saw farmers markets grow bigger, CSAs sell out immediately, all branches of the emergency food supply, from food pantries to whatever, grow enormously, seeing increase in food stamp use and so on. I think the way to generalize that is to say many people came to believe more strongly in their their local and regional food system.
Right.
Now, at the end of every crisis, those of us who would like to see serious change in this country think this is an opportunity. Crisis brings opportunity for change. And at the end of most crises in the last 30 or 40 years, what we've seen is a reversion to the status quo with things marginally better for rich people. No, with things much better for rich people and marginally worse, and sometimes much worse for poor people, and marginally worse for people in the middle. Does that happen again? I know there are lots of people working to try to strengthen the regional food system and to make it so that more and more people can rely on more and more locally grown food. But, you know, that's a little bit like trying to throw a wrench in the works when the works are the size of an auto factory and your wrench is about this big. I mean, we just don't have that kind of power. But that falls in a way under protecting rights and modeling and saying, this is how it could be done differently. Farmers markets and CSAs and food pantries, other arms of the emergency food systems are ways of saying, we have figured out a way to get more good food to more people in ways they can afford. To the extent that some of that has increased during COVID, that's been a good thing.
Absolutely. But Mark, why don't we take some questions from the audience? Our Chief Philanthropy Officer, Lisa Roth-Blackman, is going to join us, and Lisa's been monitoring the questions from the audience. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Lisa.
Some questions for Mark?
We do. There's a few, and we certainly we'll field as many of them as we can. I did want to start off and say we did get a few questions in advance, specifically about whether we were charging for this event or why weren't we charging. I think because Mark, last time you were with us, it was a fundraising event for the food bank, and so we wanted to clarify that we are not charging today. Mark is generously donating his time to be here with us and talk about the book. But if you are inspired by what you hear and you want to learn more about how you can help us to get healthy food to families in need, we will drop a link in the chat box, and certainly feel free to make a donation. So let me jump to the questions that we've got. The first one is about food packaging and how packaging also has significant impacts on our environment. Biodegradable packaging would be ideal, but in the meantime, how can that be addressed?
It's a terrific question, and it's not just packaging, it's plastics all over, plastics and chemicals everywhere. I think I read recently there are something like 70,000 unregulated chemicals that make their way into products in our environment. And we all know that, or most of you know that chemicals are not really tested for safety before they're put on the market. What really happens is that we are the testing lab. People are the guinea pigs, and if something turns out to be carcinogenic, well, sometimes it's taken off the market and sometimes it's not. To address this question directly, I think as individuals, the thing to do is use less packaging, and that usually means buying more fresh food. So we all have the option of going to the market with our own bags, with multiple use packaging, and avoiding highly packaged items and requesting minimized packaging. In terms of having impact on the food supply in general and packaging in general, there are communities that have gotten styrofoam containers outlawed, that have gotten single-use plastic bags outlawed, and so on. So in this case, I think to do something on a federal level right now, I think is pretty much hopeless. To do something on an individual and municipal level is much, much easier and more effective.
Another question is, what would it take for whole foods to be cheaper than ultra-processed foods? Do we need government taxes on processed food, subsidies for farms growing crops for human consumption rather than animal production, or frankenfoods? I'm sure you'll appreciate that phrase.
I'm going to ask you, Lisa, to read that again, because when I heard it, my mind capitalized Whole Foods. So I thought for half a sentence, I thought we were talking about the supermarket. So let's all listen to this question again and think of Whole Foods as meaning real foods, natural foods, and so on.
Yes, and it is not capitalized,
no,
to your point. So what would it take for whole foods to be cheaper than ultra processed? And do we need government taxes on processed food or subsidies for farms that are growing crops for humans rather than animals, or frankenfoods?
I mean, this is my question. This is my favorite question, and it's the question that I would like answered also. I'm not dodging it. I'm going to say what I think, but it's what I wake up every morning wondering and go to bed every night wondering. And it's what frustrates me and drives me crazy and makes me think I shouldn't even bother to talk about food at all, because it's just so challenging. So that's the question. How do we get it so that food that's good for you is the food that's most present in the marketplace, is affordable, accessible, available to everyone, and food that's bad for you starts to play a smaller and smaller role? That is exactly the right question. So yes, it has to do with taxes and policy, which then means it has to do with how do we make change in government policy at the highest levels. And I can't address that because I don't know the answer to that question, and neither does anyone else. It's defeating the filibuster. It's working for progressive candidates. It's confronting politicians on every level and saying, what are you doing about making the food that's available to Americans better? But I'll add this because I think it's a good clarifier. It's not easy to raise food for hundreds of millions of people, and that's how we do it in this country. We don't have, let's say, we don't have 50 million farms, each of which feeds 6 or 8 people. We don't have 10 million farms, each of which feeds 30 or 40 people. We don't even have 5 million farms, each of which feeds 80 or 100 people. We have like less than 1 million big farms, each of which feeds thousands and thousands of people. It's not easy and it's not inexpensive, and because profit is baked in, it becomes more expensive. But we subsidize that agriculture. We make it so that most citizens, and we're not talking about people in dire need, but real hunger, or the kind of hunger that you see elsewhere in the world, starvation hunger, remains pretty rare in the United States. But let's just stick to the 70% or 80% of people that can afford to buy enough calories. For many of those people, for most of us, that's because the agricultural system is heavily subsidized. So it's expensive to grow food, but the government helps farmers do it so that most of us can afford to eat. It's very complicated. It's one of the reasons wages are low and so on, but it's kind of a deal that's been made between capital and labor. We get to eat because the government makes food relatively inexpensive. But if we're acknowledging that the government makes food relatively inexpensive, we then have a choice. Government could afford to make good food relatively inexpensive and make junk food expensive, rather than the other way around. What's been subsidized since 1860, since the formation of the Department of Agriculture, what's been subsidized on the part of government is industrial food, is making junk food and highly processed food as inexpensive as possible at great cost to our health, and to making good food, fruits and vegetables, nuts and grains, well-raised animals and their products and so on. Those are the foods that are most expensive. We could tip those, good policy could tip the balance there. that's the whole, that question is the whole shtick. That's everything. You answer that question and we've solved a lot of problems.
For sure. We have a question about whether you see value to a nutritional rating system, even color-coded, on food packaging. The current nutrition facts on packages seem to fall short, is the comment.
I would love it if, the short answer is yes. I've been concerned about that for many years, even before I was able to write about policy. I wrote a little bit about nutrition labeling. I wrote one of my favorite pieces for the Times, was a piece, I think it was called My Dream Food Label. And you can find it, although sadly, because of the arcane nature of the way the Times puts things online, it's in 2 parts. But if you're diligent, you can find it. And I stand by it. It's 10 years old at this point, but it's a really good piece. I think traffic light labeling is a good start and very, I want to say primitive, but that sounds sort of negative, elementary. Red, yellow, green, everybody knows what that means. And in animal vegetable junk, I do kind of the shortest possible primer on nutrition, which, what foods you shouldn't eat hardly at all, what foods you should eat occasionally, and what foods you should eat as much of as possible. Everybody gets that notion, and red, yellow, green would help. There are other questions about food other than nutrition: where it came from, what the land was like that was grown in, and how that land was treated, whether biodiversity was encouraged or other animals, the land was made inhospitable for other animals, whether workers were treated well or not in the course of producing that food, how many pesticides or other chemicals were being used. Those are all questions I'd like the answer to. I'd like those answers on my labels. I'd like to know where food comes from and how it's produced in almost every case. And I think the more transparency there is, the more we see where our food comes from, the more likely we are to make better choices. Having said that, and I know I'm being repetitive, but some of these messages are important. Having said that, the fact that the food supply is the majority of the food supply would be yellow or red labeling, would be labeled with yellow or red dots. That's a fundamental problem, because if you say to people, don't eat much of this and don't eat any of that, you've eliminated a lot of the calories that are out there for people to choose from. In fact, if you yellow and red all the food in the United States that should be yellow and red, and people took that seriously and ate none of the red and very little of the yellow, there wouldn't be enough food in this country. There's not enough green. And that goes back to the 60% thing. If 60% of the calories are ultra processed food, that means only 40% of the calories are good for you. So that's your green light food. That's what you should be eating the most of. But not everybody can do that.
Yeah. I'm going to mush a couple questions together. You've touched on some of this a little bit, but there's a question about whether it's better to buy organic fruits and vegetables to avoid pesticides, because they're often more expensive, and also about CSAs in farmers markets and how can they be considered affordable, because it's generally much more expensive than the supermarket and generally inhabited by affluent folks. So lots of questions about cost there, but I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I am saying repeatedly in many different ways that the best food in this country is pretty much the domain of people with money. I hope it doesn't sound for a second like I'm defending that. When it comes to individuals, the best choice is to eat whole foods, again, with small W and small f. That's the best choice. We all know what eat a good diet means, and it means little or no junk food, fewer animal products than most Americans eat, more and more fresh plants as close to natural as possible. That's the primary goal. Not everybody can do that, but that's the primary goal. Organic is a secondary goal. Local is a secondary goal. Fair trade is a secondary. These are all important things. But from an individual perspective, the first important thing is to eat a good diet. Now, we have to go back to the three pillars kind of thing. We have models for how to get good food into the hands of people with less money. We have double bucks, or whatever it's called locally at farmers markets, where food stamps are worth more. Your dollar goes, your food stamp dollar goes farther at a farmer's market than it does at a supermarket when you're buying fruits and vegetables at a farmer's market. That's one way of encouraging people on food stamps to eat better. There's a pilot program actually here at Glenwood, where I live, in which my partner Kathleen Finley runs. There's a USDA pilot program here and at a few other places where food stamps can be used to pay forward on a CSA. So you can use food stamps to buy a CSA and pay it off on a month-by-month basis, because the whole idea of the CSA is to get money in the hands of farmers early, before the growing season, so they have money for seeds and equipment and so on. And that's obviously hard for people who can't come up with $400 or $600 in cash or whatever a CSA costs. So there is a pilot program that is allowing SNAP participants to buy into CSAs and pay them off over time. So those are examples. They're not solutions. They're examples of the beginnings of solutions. If you expand those kinds of programs so they address the needs of 100 million people instead of maybe 1 million people, now you're talking.
Great. We have a question about culturally appropriate foods, and how do we take into account cultural erasure when it comes to access to healthy foods? Many culturally significant foods, such as rice, beans, and plantains, are more expensive than hyper-processed. Why is that? I think you've touched on that a little bit. And how do we institute better nutrition education? There's a couple of questions about nutrition education in schools that take into account foods that support a variety of cultural traditions.
I mean, this is all about local control, and this is a terrific point, and answers the question which has yet to be asked, the what can I do question. And one of the answers to the what can I do question is get involved on a local level. And the most accessible, the easiest way into this is in schools. The easiest way for people to have an impact on especially what their children are eating, but of course that means what future generations are eating, is to get involved in the school board and this local school lunch program in even your particular child's or neighborhood's school, and to say, we want real food in this school, and we want food that represents the traditional diets of the children who are at this school. I will say that rice, in my opinion, rice and beans are one of the few foods that are not more expensive than junk food, and should be sort of, I don't know about top priority, but should, the legume, the bean is the most important source of protein in the world. We just don't see it. Not everyone, most people in the United States don't see that, because we have been traditionally a very meat-heavy country, and there's a number of reasons for that. It has to do with that same surplus we were talking about before, but also that the current culture of this country has been dominated by people who came from the conquering countries of Europe, where meat was really important. So legumes were never as important here as they should have been, or as they have been elsewhere, but they are the most important source of protein in the world, and they are, in some ways, if you were going to say what is a good diet, what would a good diet look like? Well, one of the backbones of that good diet would be legumes and whole grains, which, you know, you can shortcut by saying rice and beans.
I'm going to divert to one cooking question along the lines of beans. Have somebody specifically asking whether you have learned a better method for cooking dried beans than they found in one of your early cookbooks?
I mean, here's what I think now. Everything works. I mean, you can use any method that you want. I just met somebody recently who soaks. You know, the whole thing about beans was don't salt too early because it takes them longer to cook. And then I made friends with somebody who brines their beans, who soaks them in salted water, and I tried that, and it's really good. I think there's way more methods to cook beans than you can count, and more of them work than don't work. So I would say play around, and you'll find the method that suits your timetable. Fewer and fewer people, I think, soak beans because more and more people don't think that far ahead. So you can cook any bean from scratch in 2 or 3 hours, or if you have a pressure cooker, in a half an hour, and that's the preferred method of many people these days.
Great. And before we move off of sort of culturally appropriate foods, I did want to mention we are really prioritizing looking at that as part of our new strategic plan that will be adopted in a month or so, and looking at, are we providing the foods that people want and that they expect culturally, and what do we need to do to invest to make sure that we're providing those things, both in produce and other items. So it's exciting to be part of this and having the conversation. But back to the questions here, we have a question about GMO foods. What's your opinion about GMO foods?
I asked Michael Pollan, who's a friend, that question 15 years ago or so, and got the best answer ever. So I'm going to repeat it here. GMOs, in a way, are like conveyor belts. That is, they support industrial food production, but they are not the cause of industrial food production. And the ways that we know this are, one, industrial food production predates GMOs, and two, if you manage to take GMOs out of the market, you'd still have industrial food production, as you do in much of Europe. Having said that, GMOs have not lived up to their promise, and it is a promising technology. It has been and will continue to be a promising technology, but it's not a technology that has been put to much good use. It has not increased yield as was promised. It has not decreased the use of pesticides as was promised. In fact, it's increased the use of pesticides, and the most commonly used pesticide right now is glyphosate, or Roundup, which is the pesticide used in conjunction with Monsanto, now Bayer's genetically engineered corn. It's a carcinogen. So not only should it not be used as a pesticide, it makes that whole arm, and it's the best-selling, most profitable arm of genetic engineering, it makes that whole arm of genetic engineering not suspect isn't the right word, culpable. So yeah, genetic engineering has not been a good thing for the food system. It's not the cause of industrial food. It's not the fundamental underlying problem, but it's something we need to address.
I have a question from somebody that really read the book because they're referencing specific pages. But let me read you the question.
Probably know it better than I do in that case.
Yeah. On page 83, you raise structural racism in the redistribution of land. And then on page 262, you raise the plight of immigrant farm workers. Can you elaborate more on these topics?
Yeah. Thank you for reading the book so carefully. How do I address this quickly? I talked, when Andrew and I were first talking, I said, well, let's go back to the Homestead Act, which was 1862. The federal government took land away from from its rightful owners, who were indigenous Americans, with no compensation other than death and disease. And it gave that land to white European men and their descendants. That's still who owns the land. So that's baked in. That is the definition of structural racism. That is baked in inequality that can't be remedied by people being nice to one another. It can't be remedied by us saying, oh, we're all God's children, or we're all equal under the law. It can only be remedied by addressing those fundamental inequalities that have led to, in general, white people being wealthier than not white people, and especially white Europeans and their descendants being wealthier than the descendants of enslaved people. That means land reform. And land reform is a dirty word or a dirty phrase in the United States. But gay marriage was a dirty phrase in the United States until 15, 20 years ago. And reparations was a dirty word in the United States, and it can now be used in polite company. So I think we have to recognize that the way that land was distributed in the US in the 19th century has an impact on everyday life right now. And it can only be remedied by looking carefully at that and by coming up with some kind of system that will address that. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's not even going to happen in this administration. It may not happen in our lifetimes, but it's something that is destined to happen and must happen. I mean, it's that or catastrophe. The plight of immigrants, not dissimilar, but generally speaking, American agriculture, and this is especially true with people from Mexico, American agriculture has seen immigrants as a flexible workforce to be exploited. Now, it's also true that American agriculture exploits workers who are not immigrants also, and increasingly people we call immigrants are children of immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants. And I think when this misuse of the word immigrant in a way now, because of course, except for indigenous Americans, and I don't know how you categorize African Americans. It takes some thought and conversation, but everyone here is an immigrant or the descendant of an immigrant. So when we talk about immigrants in agriculture, I think we're mostly talking about people from Mexico, Central and South America, and those people have been seen as a sort of as needed workforce to be exploited by agriculture. But I want to reiterate, everybody who works for industrial agriculture, except for the owners, is pretty much exploited regardless of where they're from. That was a long answer, sorry.
That's all right.
Important question.
She also wants to know how she can get her book signed, which is hard in the day of Zoom right here, but.
Come visit me in Truro in July, I think.
Excellent. We have a question about, are you encouraged by the development of urban farms? And do you see these initiatives being able to help envision a future of healthier urban communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the modeling thing. Urban farms, I think there's two kinds of urban farms. There's farms that happen to be in cities, like vertical farms done by high-tech investors that are really groovy and provide microgreens to expensive restaurants. Those are not so important. Urban farms that show people how food is grown, that build community, that build power in community, those are really important. And yeah, they're encouraging. It would be more encouraging if we saw more of them, but those are great models. And we look to Detroit in many ways for urban farming, because Detroit had the unique problem of abandoned city lots way before most other cities did, and many Detroiters have turned that into an asset by saying, we're going to farm on those lots. We're going to build community around this land. We're going to grow food in city limits and near city limits, not only to try to feed our community, but to teach our community what farming is, what power is, what land ownership is about, and so on.
Great. I have two more questions. One I think is a quicker one, and then a closing one. So the potentially quick one is, are vitamins worth the money, or as a balanced diet enough to be healthy?
Yeah, I wish that was a quick question, but fortunately, I don't know. I don't feel confident enough in my answer to go on and on about it. If I ask that question of the people I respect most in that world, they say, take an omega-3 fatty acid supplement and take a probiotic and maybe take vitamin D and leave it at that. Other people will say, don't bother to take anything. Other people will say it's different from one individual to another. I will say that anecdotally, I took a giant handful of vitamins every morning for about 20 years. And I started to think it was like voodoo. That is, I started to think, well, if I stop taking these, obviously I'm just going to drop dead. But one day I did stop taking them, and I stopped taking them for about 10 years, and I was completely fine. And then, I don't know, I turned 65 or whatever, and I started thinking, oh, well, I should probably take fish oil, or I should probably take vitamin D. Everybody's taking vitamin, and now I take a handful of vitamins every morning again. So I'm probably the wrong person to answer that question.
Fair enough. All right, Mike, I like this question. I think we'll close with this one. Is there any good news?
Well, debt relief for Black farmers integrated into the COVID Relief Act by the Biden administration is one good piece of news. The Justice for Black Farmers Act, Cory Booker's got an anti-CAFO act, I can't remember what it's called. Those are both hung up in Congress. The fact that we can even talk about passing good food legislation is encouraging. You know, I think if we want more good news, I mean, I don't know why I would say, I'm not going to apologize for saying this. If we want more good news, we need more progressive people in to represent us on every level, municipal, state, and especially federal. We all know what a mess the Senate especially is right now, and that would be different if there were 5 more progressive Democrats in the Senate right now. So, you know, it's if we had been talking about climate change, if we had been talking about income inequality, if we had been talking about gender discrimination, racism, public transportation, the last word would be the same word, which is that we need forward-thinking people to represent us at all levels of politics, and that goes for food as much as it goes for all of those other things. Good closing note.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. This has been a terrific conversation. I'm so glad that you were able to be here today and talk to the wonderful people in the Rhode Island audience again.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Hugh. You did a great job in keeping up with stuff, as I can see in the chat. See you all sometime. Andrew, come visit. Thank you for a very interesting hour.
I want everyone to know that you can purchase Mark's book at Books on the Square. And if you do, 20% of your purchase will go to the food bank. So thanks to everybody for joining us today, and have a good one.